Hi, I'm Bob Switzer, and this is the Epic Narrative. Well, now, where did we leave off? Oh, yes, that's right. We left off with David going back to work after an amazing experience being anointed the next king of Israel. Remember, Samuel came in, had that sacrifice, the big party, the banquet, and yet in the end, David ends up in the same place as he did before this great event, which quite honestly happens to a lot of people, right? You have this great experience with God, and you go to an event, you go to a camp, right? We've all, well, maybe not we've all, but I've been to camp, ran a camp, loved it. But you'd have these campfire experiences. You go throw a stick in the fire, rededicate your life to Christ, which was it's such a crazy way to phrase it. Stay focused. Yeah, Bob, I know. This is not a commentary on camp. We're trying to tell the story of David. All right. So you have this amazing experience, and in the end, you go home. Or after the service, you get in the car and go home, and it's family again, and it's life again, and it's work again, and nothing really changed. And that's the way it was with David. Nothing really changed after his big anointing, big vote of confidence and assurance from God that he had what it takes, and he was a son of Jesse, and the whole family knew this now, and the whole village knew this now, and Samuel knew this, everybody knew this, and yet, just back to work, bro. Nothing changes. But I believe David, this is where the heart of David was different than Saul. There was something in the heart of David that said God's going to have to make this happen. Like, he trusted. There was an intuitive trust that God could make this happen. He had clearly had some crazy experiences being a shepherd, killing bear, killing lion, killing wolves, protecting the sheep. Like, this was not every day, but this was he had a grid for amazing, miraculous deliverance. So I think that in his own processing of what had occurred when he's back out there, as we said, I think he communed with God on a deep mystical level as an artist, and God had developed in him this intuitive trust that he could make it happen. I mean, honestly, when you're out there in the field, on the hills, hillsides and valleys of around Bethlehem, like, but how else can this happen? Unless God steps in, there's really no way for this to happen. Samuel couldn't make it happen. All right, as much as Samuel had a role in the cabinet of Saul, he wasn't a part of Saul's everyday world, right? As a matter of fact, he had committed himself not to talk to Saul ever again. So even though he had the position of priest of the nation, and people probably honored that, and others didn't, because he didn't take that. He just didn't have that role. Okay, Bob, focus. I know. You're getting stuck in in last week's or last. I don't know. I don't even know when did that one get. You don't know either. All right. I don't know what podcast that was, but I'm stuck there. I need to move on. So David's in the fields. David's doing his work. He's got to trust God to show up. Now, well, meanwhile, back at the palace, Saul is doing what he wants. He's leading the nation. He's enacting laws. He's collecting taxes. He's gathering servants around him. And that would involve runners, messengers being sent out to the various tribes, to the various elders of the tribes, saying, I want every tribe to send, or every elder of the tribes to send me, one of your daughters to be a servant in the palace. There's a lot of logistics in setting up any government, especially when it's from scratch. They didn't have a king. He didn't take the place of a king. He's the first king. And there was a lot of pressure on him, a lot of decisions that had to be made. I'm sure at times it felt like he was micromanaging things, and other times he just wanted to give up, authority to somebody else to run things. I think his father probably stepped in and took care of a lot of that, just because I think his father, as said in a previous podcast, I think his dad was a very powerful, demanding man. And I think that's why Saul struggled so much with self-rejection, is because he picked up early in life that you had to be pleasing. You couldn't disappoint. You had to behave correctly. And whether his dad did that intentionally or not, I think Saul developed a pretty strong sense that if you wanted approval, it had to come from someone else. And if you wanted self-approval, was never going to fully be realized, because he knew himself really well, and there was always opportunity to find something wrong with yourself. So this is an important verse in 1 Samuel 16, verse 14. I'm reading out of the New International Version. Not that I think it's the version to have. It's a good one. You can have. I'm not. You'll pick up on this as we go, but I'll state it. I grew up in a King James only childhood, and I think the King James is whatever translation you have. Like I've moved into a more open connections translations and paraphrases, and there's just so many nuances in the Hebrew language. And that's part of my point that I'm going to make here is this is the way the verse reads. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. Now you read that in the quote straight English, and that just looks really that's disturbing. That's just disturbing. Because it sounds like the Lord's playing emotional games and mental games with Saul. I'm going to take my spirit away from him, and I'm going to send an evil spirit to him. So I'm going to torment him and cause him emotional and maybe even physical harm, because he upset me. He made me mad. I'll get him back. I'll get him back for being so rude to me and not listening to me. I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him good. And this is why I'm open to all of those things, is because there's translational filters that you cannot avoid when you're a translator. When you interpret things, you can't get out of the way. Now listen, this happens in everyday life. People use words to communicate, and they assume that the word that they're using is interpreted the same way by the person who's hearing it. And this causes all kinds of opportunities to get to know each other, because you say things like, hey, well, just even like being on time, right? That's one that is so huge. So huge. Being on time to one person can mean literally 30-minute difference to somebody else. Show starts at 9 o'clock. We're going to be there on time. Okay, awesome. Well, that person meant on time meant 10 of 9. because then you have 10 minutes before the show starts. And on time to the other person means we're pulling into the parking lot at 9, which means we get out of the car and we walk into the building and we go to the show. We get to our seats about 9:10. Well, those two people are probably going to have an opportunity to have a conversation because somewhere along the line, those two definitions are going to run into each other. So I think when people are translating, oftentimes their mindset has an impact on the words that they use to translate. It's not that they're doing a bad job. It's that they have to make a choice because there's nuances in the language that are legitimate, but they change the way things look and sound. So if you believe that in the sovereignty of God, that all things come from him, good and evil, then you have to give God credit for bad things happening to people. And that's that's disturbing. And I know that has driven many people away from a relationship with a loving God because they look at verses like this and they say, how can a loving God do that? How can a loving God send an evil spirit to torment somebody? Like that's just manipulative, and it's disturbing. And what kind of good father would do that to a child? Or a father says, listen, I'm not going to talk to you anymore. I'm not going to spend any time with you because you made me really mad. You made me really mad. I'm really hurt. I'm hurt and offended by what you've done. So I'm not going to talk to you anymore. And I'm going to send this little attack dog is going to run you around the yard, and anytime you try and do something, it's going to try and eat you. It's going to attack you. So good luck with that. Have fun. There, that'll teach you to ever offend me again. Well, listen, you can't be love and be offended. It just doesn't happen. I'm not saying, oh, Bob, I know I jumped into this one, but I'm not saying that there aren't boundaries in love. There are, but there isn't offense. There isn't. And I don't think God was offended by what Saul did. And I don't think God sent an evil spirit. Now, what I do think is that because of the choices that Saul was making, he was no longer aware of God's help. He just because I believe because of self-rejection, because of what he and Samuel had been through, Samuel won't come talk to him anymore. He was just at a loss. He really felt like, okay, if something's going to happen, I'm going to have to make it happen. And it became a matter of pride, but pride is a form of self-rejection because it hides the fact that you don't ever think you're going to measure up. And that kind of pride, that kind of insecurity is very tormenting. And man, when you're alone and you feel the weight of your decisions, if he's sitting in a room and it's got all of his relatives in it and they all have roles within the government and they're waiting for him to make a decision, and he's thinking, oh man, I'm going to disappoint somebody. What if I make the wrong decision? What if the nation is impacted by this? It's my job to keep the nation safe. It's my job to find, revenue streams for the nation. It's my job. And that'll torment you if you don't have confidence in who you are. If you don't know the paradigm through which you make decisions. If you can't dream and you don't have goals because you've taught yourself to keep your expectations low or out of, to not have expectations because they cause disappointment and they make you feel bad about yourself and you begin to reject yourself even more. Like all of those things impact Saul, and it impacts his ability to hear from God. I've spoken to people like this, where they say, I don't hear, God doesn't talk to me. And yet as they're talking, I can see how God is trying to talk to them, is trying to give them words of encouragement, is trying to show them that they're loved. But when you don't believe in yourself, when you don't believe that God has made you into something that's amazing, when you have shut down your ability to dream to dream the way love encourages you to dream. Love just expands your ability to dream, because it knows that no matter what you, quote, fail at, you're always accepted and you're always loved. That's what it's like. That's what God wants you to live in. And Saul had separated himself from that. So yes, the, quote, Spirit of God had departed, because Saul was no longer connected to love on a regular basis. And yes, an evil, quote, evil spirit was tormenting him. What was that evil spirit? The evil spirit was the lies that he was believing. The lies that he was believing, that God didn't really like him, that God had left him, that he was alone in this world, that everybody around him was just trying to destroy him. When you feel that way, and and I think of Saul in this case, right? He's feeling this way. I don't blame him for going out on the battlefield, because at least there, the goal was clear, right? The goal is clear. Beat those guys. Go kill those guys. And he would. And then at least for 10 minutes in his life, he'd feel success. He'd feel like he had some sort of goal, he had some sort of purpose, he had some sort of identity. He was the king, he was the leader in the battlefield, his sons were with him, they defeated the enemy, and they could at least go back with a victory. But then he had 1,000 decisions to make, and every one of them reminded him that he might disappoint somebody, that there were expectations upon him, that there were goals that needed to be reached and set. Like, well, what do you want to do, King? And he'd have to tell them. But he didn't believe the words that he was saying, and he would probably defer to other people. Well, Dad, what do you think we should do? And everybody would watch this kind of thing go on, and they would start to doubt his leadership. And so he couldn't show that there was other influences in his decision-making process, because if he showed the influences in his decision-making process, then people would doubt his leadership. And if they doubted his leadership, then he would doubt his leadership. Oh my gosh, I'm telling you, no wonder, quote, an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. It didn't come from God. It came from within. But when you believe that the only option you have with God is that he's in charge of everything, that he has that he is the puppet master, then yes, you have to believe that the exact phrasing of this verse. Or you could believe that God and his principle of freedom that love has, that God is really loving, in that he allows you to have the results of your choices, then this is what's going on. See, the Jewish community, much like a lot of evangelical communities, have this idea of God's sovereignty, right? If you don't give God credit for everything, then you've taken some sort of glory from him. Or that maybe God doesn't do it. This is the second thing. But he lets the bad guys, the enemy, he lets the evil one, he lets the devil come and do it for him. And both those things were prominent and still are in the Jewish community. So as the translators are writing this, they want to make sure, I think they're trying to say God's in control of everything. If we give credit to anything else, then somehow we're saying God isn't in control. And I believe that God's sovereignty oversees all decisions and all results of those decisions at all times. And God did not send the evil spirit, but he definitely knew that it was available. He definitely knew that Saul had opened himself up to those things. And Saul was feeling the results of those decisions. Listen, look at the word punishment from the Hebrew, right? We think of the word punishment as invoking, like, making people feel afraid, making them feel pain, separation, shame. It's something you always want to avoid, right? So you hide your bad behavior. You make sure no one knows what's going on. You want to avoid punishment. Punishment in our selfish Western mindset is a really bad thing, right? But in the Hebrew, the word is for punishment is the word avon, which, of course, makes me think of all kinds of funny things to say about makeup and hand cream. But basically, the word avon carries with it both what you did wrong and its consequences. So to punish someone, it comes, basically that word avon is like a little bit of a story. It basically says, let someone sit on the crooked path. You get to, quote, bear your iniquity. You carry your punishment. You sit on the path that you've created. You feel the results of the decisions you've made. And that's what's happening here with Saul. He's feeling the results of the decisions he's made to not maintain connection to the love and presence that God has made available to him. And I know God's made it available to him because we will continue the rest of this chapter. So Saul is tormented. I do know that in this passage, a lot of people use this for for mental issues that they believe Saul might have had. That Saul had some sort of bipolar or schizophrenia going on, that this was a mental disorder, that and that this is God exposing that. Others believe, have taken this verse because God sent the evil spirit. They talk about the fact that that God sends evil demons to oppress people so that they can learn from the oppression of the enemy and maybe turn their lives back over to him. Or God has completely turned his back on them and he lets them be tormented in some, it's just so counterintuitive to what I believe about God, because I believe God looks like Jesus and Jesus didn't do this. So it's just really hard for me to process, but to even say it out loud. But yes, there's people who preach and teach that, God uses the devil to do his evil work. Kind of like, God's like some kingpin in the narcos world, and he doesn't ever get caught pulling the trigger or blowing things up, but he gives a nod to his right hand man who knows, oh, okay, that person's gonna die. And that guy makes all the arrangements, and then somebody 15 layers away from the actual king narcos does the evil deed. And if he gets caught, no one can tie it back to the kingpin. And so there's kind of this mindset sometimes within God that God does that. Like, he looks at Saul made him mad and offended him, and so he looks at one of his angels and he just kind of gives this nod, like, and doesn't actually say anything, but all the arrangements are made, and then the evil demon can come down and beat up Saul whenever he wants. I don't think God operates that way, but I do believe the people who translated the scriptures did think God operated that way, and they didn't want to give credit to anyone else but God. So there we go. The servants, it says that Saul's attendants said to him, right? Even their mindset is this: see, an evil spirit from God is tormenting you. Wow. Isn't it nice when people around you encourage you? Isn't it nice when they agree with your philosophy? They're like, yeah, God did this. God did this to you. Absolutely. Oh man, I tell you, I've heard this too, right? You sprain your ankle. Wow, what do you think God's trying to teach you? I don't know. You really think God sprained my ankle? Well, you know, he causes all, he does it all. And they'll quote some New Testament verse like, he works all things for your good. Yeah, that doesn't mean he caused all things. Maybe I sprained my ankle because of a choice I made. Maybe I opened myself up to, twisting my ankle when I was running, when I was jumping, when I was hiking. Maybe God didn't cause it. Oh, no, you're telling me God's not sovereign. No, I'm just saying that I have a lot of freedom and I can make choices. And sometimes I might sprain my ankle. It's not God's fault. But here's, Saul's attendants are the same way. They're like, oh, Saul, God's coming after you. Let us search for someone who can play the lyre, which is an instrument. Basically, let's get a really good musician in here. And when he will play and the evil spirit from God comes on you and you'll feel better. Man alive. This is crazy. I mean, honestly, they're looking at this and this is their solution. God's sending you an evil spirit. So we're going to find somebody who plays really good music, because when you worship, when the evil spirit from God comes upon you and you worship God, then the evil spirit from God will depart from you, because you'll be worshiping the God who sent the evil spirit to begin with. Like this just doesn't make any, I mean, I know it doesn't make sense, and I don't want to be mocking of them, but it's one of those things where when you break down what people are actually saying, it doesn't make sense. And that's what I'm trying to do. Even in this story, like it's really easy to read this story and say, see that clearly God's sending the demon to oppress Saul, and his servants are like, hey, let's find somebody who plays really good music so that you'll feel better when the evil spirit comes. So that they're, the staff, the royal staff, is trying to contain the damage that's happening to Saul. They need Saul to make decisions. They need Saul to lead the nation. And when Saul becomes so spiral, he just starts to spiral into these self-doubt, self-rejection, depression, disappointment, frustration, anger. He just doesn't get out of it because he feels the weight of everything, right? So he's just pacing. He's upset. He feels it's all negative. Let me just put it. I was going to give a list of negative emotions. He's just feeling all negative, and they need him to lead. They need him to be king. They need him to not, stay locked in a room, wherever that room was, bathroom, bedroom, royal chamber of some sort. They need him to come out. So they're like, listen, why don't we find somebody who can play good music, and it'll soothe you. It'll make you feel better. And then you can basically get on with life. They're just trying to contain damage. They're trying to move the nation forward. They've got to make something happen. You can kind of, see the scuttlebutt around the palace. Like, well, Saul's in one of his moods. Like, what do you want us to do? Well, where is he? I mean, he's in his room. Well, when is he coming out? We need a decision. Well, uh, sometimes he's in there for a while. Oh, and the frustration, because things back then, it wasn't like they could just make another phone call, right? Somebody travels somewhere, some elder, some messenger from somewhere travels to the palace. They send a message. They bring something that Saul requested, and now Saul isn't available to receive it. Saul isn't available to make the decision. Saul isn't available to approve something that's been presented. And I don't know. I don't think this happened daily. I think this probably happened. Well, I don't know. A lot of times depression happens in a rhythm. People, every so often, when they see certain things or do certain things, it's a trigger, right? That's what we call it, a trigger. They get triggered. So I don't know what that trigger point was for Saul, but his servants, his royal staff was like, okay, we need to try and fix this. Well, Saul doesn't like being in that place, right? He doesn't like being in a depression. So he says, yes, find somebody who plays well and bring them to me. Dun, 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 dun. So this is the first way. This is the first path that comes for David. Verse 18, one of the servants answers. So one of the royal staff. When you see servants, I know sometimes you think slaves, right? We get the slave mentality, especially here in America, because that was an unfortunate, not unfortunate, it was evil. It was a horrible past, a horrible thing that we have in our past, right? But that's what we think. We think of slaves being beaten. We think of them being, mistreated, not viewed as equals, and equal in value to God or to anyone else. It would have been different when you see that word servant as a Hebrew servant in the Hebrew palace. It's more the idea of staff. These are employees. These are young women and young men who have been assigned to serve the king, and it usually came with a time period. It was kind of like it was almost like being an intern. So they would have come from all over the country. From every tribe would have sent a certain number of staff to the royal palace. So one of them says, "Oh, I know this guy. I know this guy. He's I love this. I've seen a son of Jesse in Bethlehem." Yeah. So the servants know who David is. I love that. I love that the staff, those who David lived with, those who David was raised with, they knew him to be the son of Jesse. They knew that Samuel had come and anointed him as a son of Jesse to be the next king of Israel. They knew that God had in essence approved or agreed that David was a son of Jesse. And even though Jesse sent his son back out into the field and pretended like nothing happened, so to speak, the servants knew. The family staff knew he's the son of Jesse. So I've seen a son of Jesse who knows how to play the lyre. Oh, man. He's amazing. He's a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well. He's good looking. And God is with him. Now that's a heck of a resume right there. Holy smokes. I mean, I read something like that and I think, wouldn't that be awesome? Like that's how you're remembered by the people that you've worked with. Remember, this is coming from a young man or woman who's on royal staff, who had probably been on staff maybe even in Jesse's household. But if not in Jesse's household, he was on staff or one of the sons or daughters of an elder in Bethlehem. But he knew David, and this is how he describes him. I mean, this is awesome. talented. He's a talented musician. He's brave. The stories of his exploits defending the sheep were well known, and a warrior. In other words, he is somebody who understands right and wrong. He understands justice and righteousness. He speaks well, probably because his mother taught him how to read and write so that he could be articulate. And he's dang good looking. Jesse's sons were good looking boys, and David has some really good looking kids too. Like I said, I didn't look that up. I meant to look up that the name of that group of people from Game of Thrones. I can see them, man. The dark hair. They hung out with the Dragon Queen. Oh man, that's a story. Anyways, so Saul sends messengers to Jesse. Send me David, your son David. Isn't that awesome? Who is with the sheep. Send me your son David. Whoa. That had to be a nice little poke in the nose from Saul to Jesse. Of course, Saul didn't know he was upsetting Jesse when he did this. He just was like, oh, all right. Well, go get him. Now, it wasn't like a personal note from Saul. It would have been, go get him. You know who he is. Go get him. So the royal staff, sends a messenger. Maybe this person goes, but they go to Jesse and they're like, Saul wants David, the one who watches the sheep. He wants him at the palace. Now, Jesse doesn't, he really has no opportunity to fight this because it's, from Jesse's perspective, he's just a servant. He's just a guy who watches sheep, so I can afford another one. So Jesse takes a donkey, he loads it up with bread and a big jug of wine and a young goat, and he sends him with David to Saul. Why would he need all that stuff? Well, when you went into the service of the king, you were also responsible for your own food. Your family, or the family from which you came to serve the king, they were responsible to feed you. And that was true even when, like, if you went into the army, like, and you were out in battle, your family was responsible to send food. So he would have brought this food, not, he didn't have like a locker where he kept it, but he would bring it and he would have turned it into the guy in charge of all the food, not the cook, although he knew where it was. But that's how the king would replenish all of his stores, is all of his servants, their families would have to send, in essence, money. Today we would have done like a money transfer, so to speak. It would be like going to camp. I'm going to go work at camp, but it's going to cost me, right? I need to raise support because the camp needs to house me and feed me for the next 10 weeks. So I need, I need to send some money ahead of me. That's the kind of mindset that this is. And that's how David came to Saul and entered into his service. Saul liked him a lot. And he became, quote, one of his armor bearers. So David's called on, right? And as a servant, like I said, he brings his own food. Saul likes what's going on around him. He likes the atmosphere that David has. He likes the music that David plays. He likes the lyrics that David sings. He wants David to be a regular. That doesn't mean that he saw Saul a lot. He was one of his armor bearers. That was like an honorary position. It was like something he would just bestow on people so that they would have a title, so that they could be around the palace. It's kind of like getting a guest, like getting a visitor's pass. You get to keep it. You can come visit anytime. You can walk in anytime. That's what David got when he said, okay, he's going to be one of my armor bearers. He now has a reason to be in the palace when I need him. But it wasn't he wasn't like standing next to Saul. He didn't hold Saul's sword or his shield. He just he had an excuse, he had a reason, he had a title to be available to Saul whenever he was called upon. So in this position, like I said, the access of David would have been there. Now, Saul sends, a word to Jesse. He's like, allow David to remain in my service, for I like him. I like having him around. What did he like about him? Well, he said, whenever the spirit from God came on Saul, David would take up his lyre and play, and relief would come to Saul, and he'd feel better, and the, quote, evil spirit would lead him. So this is again, like, if you break this down, it's literally God fighting against God, right? If you read it, quote, what the word of God says, if you don't spend the time to actually understand what's trying to be communicated here, you start to think that God literally sends the evil spirit, and then he sends David as a twisted way to put David in the palace and to give him access to Saul so that he can be trained in the leadership of the country without Saul knowing that David is actually God's man for the job. And then David plays, and God sends his spirit down to the evil spirit and tells the evil spirit to leave. So Saul's like, oh, I feel so much better. And then he spends time with David, and David's his armor bearer, and he trains David, and David's able to hear and see all that's going on in the palace. And you have this whole weird God fighting against himself, and literally moving people around like puppets, or quote, pieces of chess pieces on a chessboard, pawns and knights and kings, and it's not the way love behaves. It's not the way Jesus behaved. So it's not the way God behaves. So what we see here is that when David plays, when David's in the room, when David's available, the words he sings and the way that he plays, right, he shifts the atmosphere. He reminds Saul of God's goodness. He reminds Saul of God's love. That is a place where Saul probably, I would say Saul feels himself. He feels most at home in the presence of God, which I think is why God called him to be king to begin with. Because when Saul worships, when he connects with God, he's a completely different person. He's who God made him to be, which is not unusual when people are in the presence of God. And what God wants to be, right, is he wants to say, listen, this is where you can live. Experiences like this are meant to be the on-ramp to a highway, to a lifestyle. They're not designed to be individual events that only occur occasionally. So David calls out God's goodness. He calls out God's love. He reminds Saul of who he is. He reminds Saul of how God sees him. And it's not that David's singing these words to Saul. It's not like, Saul, you're a wonderful man. God loves you, blah, 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 blah. No, he's singing about God. He's singing about God's goodness and his love and his defense. The way that God defends the innocent, the way that he defends, brings justice to unjust situations. He sings about life in the fields. He sings about the beauty of nature. He sings about all of God's creation. These are things that just allow Saul to rest in the presence of God. And when that happens, the love of God in David drives the fear of man out of Saul. Wow. Think about that. The love of God in David drives the fear of man out of Saul every time. And that's what we get to do too. The love of God in us literally can drive the fear of man out of other people. But we have to be in that place where we live in the love of God. And a lot of people don't. We, like Saul, have so convinced ourselves that we're not worthy of God's love that we don't live there. We don't maintain access to what God's made available to us. And we become depressed, and we start rejecting the idea of God loving us. We start being in a place where we think, oh, I'll never get through this. Oh, bad things always happen to me. Oh, God must be, quote, punishing me. No, no, none of that's true. But I do I do understand. I understand that so many people make a theology that fits their experience versus having a theology and saying, all right, I don't care what my experience is. This is what's true. And what I know that's true about God is that God is love. And love doesn't behave like that. Love doesn't put an evil spirit on you in order to prove a point or to punish you. We go back to what I said earlier, right? Punishment was the idea that you sit in the path that you created. You bear the weight of your own decisions, but that doesn't mean that God's goodness isn't there, and it doesn't mean that his presence isn't there. He's in you. He's never going to leave you. You can always access him, and that's what David reminded Saul. God hasn't left you. His love is still with you. He still thinks you're awesome. He still calls you his anointed. You are still the king of Israel. He knows that you can do this. He trusts your wisdom. He trusts your authority. He trusts your leadership. That's why he put you here. And again, I don't think David was actually singing those words, but the presence of God would remind Saul of this, and he would arise and feel better. Yeah, he'd feel better because he could then make the decisions that needed to be made. He could come out of the room. He'd come out of the room and he could approve what needed to be approved, and he'd have creative solutions to problems that had occurred. You do know the word creative. To be creative is from the word wisdom. It's a form of wisdom. And a lot of times people think, well, you're just creative. Yeah, it means you're really wise. It means you have an access to an aspect of God's wisdom that brings solutions. Creative people are all over the place. The wisdom of God is all over creativity. And Saul would have access to that when David was done playing, so to speak. And again, I don't think David was like sitting across the room looking at Saul and saying, "Hey, Saul, thanks for inviting me in today. I think I wrote this little ditty while I was sitting in the servants' quarters. Hey, Saul, this next song," like some sort of internet cafe, right? "Hey, tonight, come here." Some little coffee shop deal. No, he probably played. He would play in a large room. There might have been a window to that room that Saul would hear the music come from. There might have been curtains separating them. It wasn't like David and Saul were arm in arm. It wasn't like a lot of people want it to be. But evil always departed, because that's what happens. Fear disappears when love shows up. Light always beats darkness. And David would remind Saul of the light. He would turn the lights on, and the darkness would disappear. And that's what happened when David played. Well, it's just a perfect place to end, I think, because it's the end of chapter 16 of 1 Samuel. So I think we'll call it a day. And I hope you guys are having a fabulous time out there. And as always, feel free to contact me. You can email me. You can go on Facebook and check out, other thoughts that I've had about a variety of subjects. They don't go near as long as my podcast. And I hope you guys have a fabulous day.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Epic Narrative. If you have questions for Bob or would like to reach out for booking, please email us at thebobswitzer@gmail.com or visit thebobswitzer.com. If you haven't already, please subscribe to The Epic Narrative podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever fine podcasts are downloaded. See you next week for another chapter in our story on The Epic Narrative.